Hello! Welcome to Where Peter is Live. I am Rachel Amiri, your host, apparently. Let's bring in the rest of our group today. We have Mike Lewis, our leader, as per usual, Melinda Ribnek, and David Lafferty, contributors to wherepeteris.com. We are here for our second live stream event. We're still adjusting to this format. And so our plan is for contributors to kind of discuss recent pieces on the website and recent topics that have arisen in the Catholic world. So today we're going to start off with the prayer that Melinda is going to lead us in, and then we will get back into our program for the day.
Okay. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit.
Amen.
Lord, Father, our human family, you created all human beings equal in dignity. Pour forth into our hearts a fraternal spirit and inspire in us a dream of renewed encounter, dialogue, justice, and peace. Move us to create healthier societies and a more dignified world, a world without hunger, poverty, violence, and war. May our hearts be open to all the peoples and nations of the earth. May we recognize the goodness and beauty that you have shown in each of us, and thus forge bonds of unity.
Amen.
Amen.
So as I said, I'm Rachel Amiri. I'm production editor for wherepeteris.com, joined by the rest of our group. If you guys would like to introduce yourselves, just get everyone up to speed. I know it's kind of interesting to see faces and voices together, so that's part of what we're doing. I don't know if, David, you want to get started?
Sure. I'm David Lafferty. I'm beaming in here from Ottawa, Ontario, Canada. And I guess I've been writing for WPI for a little while, and I guess my focus tends to be on conspiracy theory, but I get into some other topics as well. So that's it for me.
Okay. Melinda.
So I'm Melinda Ribnek. I was with you guys last time on the live, writing about ashes and Lent. You don't remember. But I've been working with Where Peter Is Now for several months, contributing, helping a little bit behind the scenes, and just happy to be here.
And I am Mike Lewis. I'm the managing editor of Where Peter Is, and I am wearing a collared shirt today because Phyllis Zagano gave us some notes.
Some constructive criticism.
Well, my mom has passed away, so I don't get advice, so I actually appreciated it. I thought about it, and I thought no, but this week I definitely, from now on, I will have a collar on for every live stream I take part in.
You look snazzy. You did a good job.
Yeah. I know. I was worried the pattern would kind of but no, HD is fantastic. So
we're all looking very professional today.
So is that our topic?
Our topic today is not collared shirts, actually. Okay. Our topic today is online Catholic rhetoric, and then how Peter is the rock of the church, right? We're gonna go there today.
Okay.
I've checked with some sources recently, so we were going to talk about that today. But first, there are some other topics that we would like to kind of move into first. So, David, you wrote something for the site this week that was about a situation in Canada that you changed your mind on, but you wanted to give us some background about these schools for Indigenous children in Canada and how they were run by the church, and many children suffered in these homes, and you fill us in. You give us more details.
Sure. So this is something that it had been kind of brewing in my head for a little while now, actually, years really, because this whole question of the residential schools for Indigenous children that existed in Canada for over a century became a really big topic of national discussion around 2015, when the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada released their final report on the legacy of the system. And it was a very damning report that caused a lot of distress and controversy as well. They came to the conclusion that the Canadian government had engaged in what they refer to as cultural genocide. So the attempt to eliminate indigenous culture, essentially. And the residential school system was one of the primary tools by which they would do this. So the residential school system was set up, ostensibly as a way of introducing indigenous populations to, a kind of modern Canadian way of living. And what went along with that was basically abandonment of traditional religious belief and traditional indigenous culture. So this was enforced very rigidly. The Catholic Church was responsible for operating the majority of the schools, although the Anglican Church, Presbyterian Church were also involved in it. So it wasn't just the Catholic Church, but the Catholic Church was responsible for the majority. So these schools were really characterized by a very sort of harsh and disciplinarian atmosphere. A lot of the children were referred to by numbers rather than by name. They were chronically underfunded by the government compared to other schools. So the food was often terrible and very meager. But there was also a lot of abuse. There was sexual abuse, physical abuse, and ultimately it's created this generational trauma that's lasted a very long time. And I have to admit, when this first came out, I had a very sort of defensive reaction to it, especially because the Truth and Reconciliation Commission asked, as one of their demands, one of their sort of calls to action, they asked for an apology from the Pope, from Pope Francis, to be delivered in Canada. And at the time, I guess I sympathized with some of the bad experience, but I thought that there were a lot of people who were actually trying to do something good here. In these schools, there was abuse. Yes, it was terrible, but you have to compare it to the time period. But it took me a little while, but after investigating the issue at a little more depth, I realized just how bad these schools were, just how unfair it was, just how traumatic it would have been for these children to be, in many cases, removed from their families and forced to kind of abandon their language, their names in some cases, their traditional beliefs. And one of the things that we run into is that as Catholics, we do want to spread the gospel. We do want we want to share, the faith with people. But reading through this, I realized that this was a mistake. This was not the way to do that. And maybe there are ways where that can happen. But I realized, we were not, of course, treating Indigenous people with anything like respect. It was a very paternalistic sort of authoritarian approach, treating them like people who needed to be civilized and all of their culture kind of tossed away so they could become, good Canadians. Pope Francis, although he did, apparently he was informed of the results of this, he decided that ultimately he wasn't able to respond in person. I don't know. At the time, I was actually a little relieved. I was kind of thinking like, maybe I'm not sure Pope Francis needs to apologize for this, but over time I've come to realize that you can have people who are good people involved and in systems that are fundamentally wrong, and the fact that these are good people, it certainly reduces their culpability in this for the sins of the system, but it doesn't erase the objective wrongness of this system. And you can't kind of explain it away that way. So I've come to feel, in retrospect, that maybe an apology is justified. And so my piece was a bit of a way to sort of explain the whole situation, explain my initial reaction, and just kind of respectfully, express my hope that the Pope will maybe one day look at this again and reconsider, coming to Canada perhaps, and either speaking to Indigenous people here, or making an apology on behalf of the church.
Now, David, you made a parallel in your piece to the orphanages in Ireland, and that the Vatican did issue a formal apology for that. Now, I know that there was some commentary a little bit after the fact that maybe the two situations aren't parallel. Did you have any thoughts on exactly what happened there, and what could have been done differently by the Vatican with Canada?
Yeah, Pope Benedict offered an apology to Catholics in Ireland for. It's a little blurry as to what specifically maybe he was referring to, but it came shortly after, I believe anyway, the publication of the Ryan Commission, or the Ryan Report, it's called. I'm not an expert on it. I read a little bit about it. But it looked at the history of the industrial school system in Ireland, which was church-run, where kids whose parents couldn't take care of them, would sometimes go, and it's so similar, the sort of the chronic underfunding, the really harsh disciplinary environment, the endemic abuse, sexual abuse, physical abuse, and chronic undernourishment, and these kind of things that left a real scar on the population. So I do think they are comparable. The one thing that makes, in my opinion, the residential school system in Canada that much worse in some ways is that the Indigenous people, the children there, were really forced to abandon everything about their identity and become completely new people in some ways, which may have made sense at the time, and but I really think that there could have been, and again, in retrospect it's easy to say this, but there could have been a way to introduce Indigenous children to the Catholic faith, to some of the the educational standards of the modern world at the time, but in a much more sort of gentle way that showed a real respect for their culture and traditions, and wasn't kind of forcing it upon them, because that's what caused the trauma. And ultimately, when you look at it, it failed. It completely failed, because it's created generations of people who fear the church, and who they look at the church as something that was essentially participating in the attempted destruction of their culture. So that makes it a little, I mean, the industrial, I'm not trying to minimize the industrial school problem in Ireland, but this is a sort of added feature of the residential school problem.
I think
Other aspect of this
That's
discussion, or if you want to go ahead, basically my thought was, and when David told me he was writing this piece, he mentioned that it did contain a little bit of a critique of how Pope Francis handled this situation. And obviously one of the things that we do at Where Peter is we try to present as best we can what Pope Francis's what angle he might be coming from, or how it might be justified. Now, I know in the past, I know that when we first started the site, and I don't know if any of you were involved with that, but right around the time we started the site was his trip to Chile. And there was the Chilean Bishop Barros, who basically, once he was transferred to the diocese, he never had a chance of, or I mean, the entire Chilean population basically went into revolt over this guy, and Pope Francis defended him, said that it was all slander. And frankly, looking at the facts, I had no answer. I couldn't see it, see what Pope Francis's justification was, other than he was relying on the word of somebody, and there was a chance he was right. But I thought that when you presented that this was an issue that you thought that that the Vatican through the Pope really should address, because it was something that the church had a hand in that did cause a great deal of hurt. I guess, can you maybe speak a little bit about the fact that you did offer a critique, but how you considered it, how you wanted to frame it? What's the right way, I guess, is a good question. Or not that we can be 100% sure, but what do you think is a valid way to offer a critique of the Pope?
Well, I mean, I think, you can. The Pope is open to, I think, respectful criticism. I think that's perfectly fair, and I think in my case, what made me feel like publishing this was that I was actually led to this new sort of conclusion about the residential schools by trying to think with Pope Francis himself. So especially, it was during the Amazon Synod, and he showed such, incredible sensitivity to, the indigenous people of the Amazon region, and it offered such a new, to me, very exciting perspective on the relationship between the church and indigenous people and indigenous culture, and how these things can be in dialogue and be brought together. And so during the whole Amazon Synod thing, I mean, along with all the other stuff that was going on, I was thinking in the back of my mind about the indigenous people of Canada, and thinking, this sort of applies to them as well. And so that kind of took me, into this sort of new perspective. So I in my mind, I'm kind of thinking with Pope Francis. I probably, in 2018, when he decided he couldn't personally respond, I was probably in that same. I probably had that same opinion. Like, maybe it's best if he just doesn't respond. And now, though, I feel like he's taken me to a new position on this, and it's so I just feel like it's my job to say, hey, this is still a thing. Maybe in the future, maybe, if you could consider addressing this one more time, I would appreciate it. Though that's my basic perspective. It's not a hostile criticism at all. And I mean, if he decided, not to, I would respect that decision. But I do think that it's worth, reconsidering and potentially considering. I mean, I'd love to see him visit Canada, so that's another reason maybe to write this, just to put in a little call for a Pope Francis visit. So but anyway, I think it's, if as long as you're sort of thinking trying to your best anyway to think with the church, with the Pope, that's I think a sign of respectful, faithful criticism.
Yeah, I totally agree with that perspective on really entering into the tension of of learning about this historical situation and how it affects the church in Canada through today, and really entering into it through the lens of what Pope Francis has taught you, and even on the basis of a lot of his teaching and his approach to the faith. So in terms of talking about respectful dialogue with one another and then with the Pope, we're going to use this as kind of our jumping off point to really bring into discussion the situation of the American church right now, where we really are dealing with a lot of tension. The biggest kind of statistic for the past week that keeps sticking out in my mind is the fact that 60 Minutes reported this study that the American Enterprise Institute did, polling American Christians about QAnon beliefs. And they found that 1 in 5 white American Catholics believe in QAnon being true. And we have found in our experience, and it's all over our website, that a lot of the overlap in American Catholics today exists between these kind of conspiracy fringe beliefs and this questioning of the Pope is the rock of the church, Peter as the rock. So let's kind of start just maybe sharing our own experiences or things that we've observed over the past few years in terms of how QAnon has really affected, or the uptake of QAnon fringe beliefs has really affected our own experiences in our parishes or communities. I know that everyone here has really written about that, either on a macro scale or on their own personal scale. I don't know if Melinda, you wanted to share some of your experience to start off. You're muted. Here, let me unmute you.
Yeah. Well, with this subject, it's a big subject, right? And there's lots of layers to it, and different angles to come at it. I don't think it's a simplistic problem. I think for me, when I speak about it, I talk about the beginnings almost being this apologetics movement, right? That highlighted the need to know about the faith, to preach it to others and that kind of thing. And with that came an emergence of figures and leaders that were really only focused on primarily and sometimes only focused on certain conservative values in the church and kind of disregarding a lot of Catholic social teaching as being liberal or as being not as important as these kind of stereotypical conservative values. So I think for me, I see that laid the framework. And so over the last decade or two, there were, in circles that I would hang around or be active in the parish with or have my family around, like there was a lot of kind of red flags along the way that came. And so things were already starting to look like there were just pieces that were not quite adding up to this holistic practice of the faith. And so the language also became very apocalyptic in these circles, right? So I remember distinctly a couple of years ago, before kind of the fringe hit social media, right? I do remember distinctly being in a conversation with someone who is now full on QAnon. And she was saying, oh, the church is going to get smaller, almost as if it was a good thing. People are going to leave the church. And, the devil's going to attack the church from all angles, and it'll be the sign of the end times kind of thing. And I remember saying to her, I would be very careful that you don't think that you're immune to that. And that's what I would say to myself, too, as I was discerning what the church would look like. Because if it's true that a lot of people will leave the church and the church is going to be smaller, I think we've all have heard that kind of famous like Ratzinger prophecy. It's said all the time in these circles. But if that's true, then the devil is more coy than that. And so to be careful, and, even in quote unquote orthodox or ultra conservative circles, to be careful of how that affects your soul, not just looking at the other and how that affects. And those types, so I would start to say these types of things in the circles that I was in, and it wasn't received very well. But things really started to escalate when you see Taylor Marshall videos and, these fringe rights. It's all online, social media videos. And just discussions about those videos started to escalate as well. And then around the time the pandemic hit and Black Lives Matter hit and Trumpism was at its peak, then the antagonism and the tension started to increase between these circles and and me and my beliefs and my activism and different Catholic social issues. And it got to a point where I was screamed at in front of my kids. It got to a point where one woman wrote me a 3-page, single-space letter about how I was a wolf in sheep's clothing. At this point, like basically my kids and I, my family and I have been totally ostracized from our parish. And we've even had like this one lady basically try to exorcise me, I guess. I don't know. But yeah, like rebuking me. And I will say and not to steal too much time here, but there's also one conversation I think of in which I was sitting down with this woman, and I love this woman dearly, and I still do to this day. But I was very close friends with her at the time. And I had her over to the house to talk about these things. And I said, I let her talk a lot about where she was coming from. And then after she was finished speaking, I got 1 minute into trying to explain about specifically, I know I brought him up a couple of times, but specifically some of the errors that Taylor Marshall was speaking in his videos. And within 1 minute, she stood up and we were both sitting and she yelled over me, like, "You will not take my Taylor Marshall." And I was like, what the heck? And at that point, and she continued to scream at me and then she left. But at that point, when she said that, I just reflected so much on that night. And I thought, there's a hold here. This is not rational. There was no reason to escalate the conversation. And even the phrasing of that, "You will not take my Taylor Marshall," even the phrasing of that is just, there's something grossly unhealthy. It's not saying, "I don't believe what you believe," or "I don't feel that way." And so so that was probably around May. And so here we are, even last May. So here we are even months after this. And it's just at that point, like, the dialogue was cut off. And basically nobody has even attempted to dialogue with me or answered my calls to dialogue. It's been more of a closing in on the echo chamber kind of thing. And so in that way, it's just progressing and progressing and progressing. And it's very hard to penetrate these communities because the echo chamber is closed off and because there's constantly new material online that feeds this. So I don't know. I hope that was kind of intro into where we're going, but that's some of my story. It's been years in the making, so there's certainly a lot there. But yeah.
I think QAnon is really kind of the culmination of this current that's been around in the church since the 19th century, or probably post French Revolution is when this Catholic reactionaryism began. And in my own upbringing, I was exposed to a lot of this. My grandfather he would read The Wanderer. He was very bitter about Vatican II. He would talk about the Freemasons and Annibale Bugnini, the architect of the new Mass, the Novus Ordo. And I grew up hearing about Freemasonic infiltration. I mean, I've mentioned before, I was probably about 10 years old when I read the book AA 1025, which stands for Anti-Apostle 1025. It's available from Tan Books, but it purports to be the secret diary of an anonymous Soviet infiltrator priest. And it's funny because it says all these things. He claims to have been part of Vatican II and one of the architects of the new Mass. And it's funny because the things that, when the book came out, like in 1970 something, all the things that had already happened, he was like totally accurate on, that he had caused. But then he said, "Oh yeah, and then instead of the Mass with the priest, it'll be tables for 10 to 12 people presided over by a man or a woman," like basically all these predictions of, all these worst nightmare type things that that radical traditionalists have always put forward. But there's always been this, and another thing about this book, and actually if you read it critically, and it's funny because on Amazon there's some, hundreds of reviews of this book, and almost all of them are 5 stars, but there are 1 or 2 1-star reviews that really break it down for like, this is not plausible. Like, there's no way that this person could have existed because someone would be able to figure out who they were if they were actually at the council. There are records of this. Or why is this communist who hates God using all of these proper traditional Catholic terms and capitalizing things like Blessed Sacrament, and it was written by a traditionalist as propaganda to make it sound like there was an infiltrator, but people believe that it's an actual factual book. Actually, I'll tell you this: I was listening to Patrick Madrid's radio show probably a year and a half ago, and he said he believed everything in that book had come to pass. I mean, this is the kind of thing. And so I was raised on this, but then when I reached a certain age, I realized, like, this is kind of a miserable way to approach your faith. it's like I've never derived 1 ounce of joy out of, and it's like you read the Gospels, you read, I had a certain affinity for John Paul II, although, there was a little, you hear this traditionalist talk like, oh yeah, a little bit too much ecumenism, and he did kiss the Quran that one time, and, but yeah, so but I realized, like, I'm reading about peace and love and joy, and yet religion is my Catholic faith is a source of fear and nervousness, and, like, if I die, how much time am I going to be in purgatory? Worrying about, and I mean, certainly there's an aspect of that in Catholicism, but it's not the focus. And so anyway, my 20s and my early 30s were kind of a journey out of this. And one of the people that helped pull me out of this was Pope Benedict, reading Jesus of Nazareth, reading The Joy of Love, reading about encounter, reading about friendship with Jesus. Like, there's a little snippet in one of his books, and it's not even a full sentence, but it was friendship with Jesus on which everything else depends. And I had never heard that in a Catholic context before in my entire life. Like, it sounded like, oh yeah, Protestants say we're friends with Jesus. And that I don't even know what the rest of the sentence was, and I can't remember which book it was in the introduction of, has stuck with me ever since. And I resolved at that point that I wanted to find what that was. And a lot of that had to do with, a lot of my journey had to do with basically unraveling these conspiracy theories. So between 2010 and 2013, I'm realizing that all of these infiltration conspiracy theories, all these fears, I mean, the biggest worry that a lot of traditionalists have had since going back to 1960 something was that this Antichrist infiltrator Pope was going to come and destroy true Catholicism, which is, if you read my piece about Peter the Rock, that is not an authentic Catholic view. So I undergo this journey. Pope Francis is elected. Granted, he made me a little uncomfortable at first. I'll admit it. I wasn't expecting a pope to, like, yeah, I'm going to have Holy Thursday Mass in a prison. I mean, gestures like that. I mean, I thought that the idea of him getting on the bus and living in Santa Marta instead of in the Apostolic Palace, I thought that was, that was kind of cool. But he was saying these things that struck me as odd, or struck me. They made me a little bit uncomfortable. But by then, I had reached the point in my journey where I realized that the Catholic Church and the magisterium and communion with the Pope are so essential that I decided to give him a chance. Now, I know I'm going on too long, but to bring us to where we are today, it took me about 6 to 8 months. I mean, I'm a since COVID, I've been very online, but I'm a fairly online person. So I had been reading Catholic blogs since like 2004, 2005. But when Pope Francis became Pope, I was really just paying attention to his message. I was reading his audiences. I was reading the summaries of his little Casa Santa Marta Chapel homilies from every morning. I was reading the books about him. So I was absorbing him. Evangelii Gaudium came out. And that, if you haven't read Evangelii Gaudium, The Joy of the Gospel, his first exhortation, that was a game changer for me. Really, like, this is how the church in the modern world is going to evangelize if we want to survive, if we don't want to be closed in and just thinking about ourselves, if we really want to change. Oh, I have a small child coming in behind me. If we really want to change the world. That's Lucy, my 4-year-old. You want to wave? Yeah. But then what happened was I noticed on the blogosphere that people were starting to fall for the same conspiracy theories that I had grown up and gotten over. And they were discovering them for the first time. And so people are saying, hey, had you heard that, communists were going to infiltrate the Vatican? Or had you heard that some of these teachings contradict past teaching? Or had you heard that even John Paul and Benedict, they were a little bit modernist too? And so all of these things were happening. I was witnessing this, and I'm like, wait a minute, I thought I was the one. I thought they had all gotten over this, all these JP2 Catholics who were happy with Vatican II. I thought that they had gotten over that hump, and little that it wasn't that they had gotten over them, it's that they had never heard them before. And now they've slid into this conspiracy mindset. And I was just like, holy cow, like somebody's got to do something to stop this. And I was hoping that the bishops would do something to stop it. But unfortunately, some of our bishops seem to not mind it or believe it. So anyway, that's kind of what inspired me to start addressing it. But I think with the election of I think Pope Francis, they were able to market him as that Pope who would destroy the church. Then when Donald Trump came around, that caused even more division and polarization in our church. And then finally, QAnon and the re-election process, I think, has really upped the ante on that conspiratorial mindset. And so, yeah, I've gone on too long, but that's kind of the journey. But this is kind of what I've witnessed, and it's just so anti-intellectual. It's so ahistorical. If people looked at the sources, tried to, don't just read that LifeSite news article, but actually look to see if there are documents or historical things that back stories that are reputable sources. But unfortunately, people seem immune. They love their Taylor Marshall, and they're just gonna trust him. So
yeah, I think both you and Melinda have really pointed out, there's in your accounts, there's kind of two aspects towards, or that are underlying kind of this slide towards division. And one of those is all these conspiracies that come from who knows where, and they keep cropping up again and again. But then a fundamental part of it too is really undermining the authority of the Pope himself. Like, maybe he's not the real Pope. Maybe there are these limits on papal authority. Maybe we need to understand our ability to dissent in different ways. And without both of those at the same time, you wouldn't really have the extent of the division that we have right now. Those are two essential ingredients. And it seems very prominent of late to especially be critiquing this idea that Peter is the rock of the church, the principle of the church's unity, and that our unity, the unity of the bishops, is understood through the lens of unity with Peter. That has somehow become a controversial statement, especially in light of your recent piece, Mike, that was posted on Monday. Now, the context of that might make it more or less controversial, given a tweet from over the weekend. But did you want to speak more to what, that you sent that piece to me and said, this is the most ultramontane thing that's ever been written. And that may or may not be true. But I think it does get at an important point.
Well, so here's the thing.
It's true. Yeah.
We get accused of ultramontanism regularly, and you also hear things like papal positivism. You hear, people come up with all kinds of Matrumism, named after Rex Matrum, one of the characters from Brideshead Revisited, who is just like, oh well, if the Pope says it's raining, then it must be raining spiritually. Like, that's the famous. So some clever blogosphere who reads too much 20th century English literature came up with that. But it depends on what you consider to be ultramontanism. If ultramontanism is believing that the Pope has more authority or that he can create doctrine than the church says, then I agree with that definition and I reject it. If it's simply like, this is what the church has taught officially about the authority and the reliability of the Pope, well, then I'm an ultramontanist, because that's what I believe. I believe what the church teaches. And so I posted a tweet that turned out to be a little bit controversial. Cardinal Sarah. Should I get into this? He made a tweet after his I apologize. Please fast forward, 2 minutes if you don't want to hear this. The Pope accepted his resignation, turned 75 in June, and he basically said, the Pope accepted my resignation upon my reaching 75 years old today. My only rock is Jesus, or my only rock is Christ. And then I think he finished by saying, I look forward to seeing you in Rome in the future, something like that. And to me, now I've been following Cardinal Sarah closely, and I don't think he is a heretic. I don't think he is totally against the Pope or is an enemy of the Pope, but it's clear if you look from history, they weren't quite on the same page. And I think that they were a cause for frustration for each other. I've talked to people who know, I don't know anybody who knows both of them very well, but I've talked to people who know one and who know the other, and it's a strained relationship. There have been at least 4 incidents where Cardinal Sarah has said something publicly that has required a correction from the Vatican because he wasn't exactly speaking for the office that he works for, but it was always taken that way. And anyway, so I sort of said, is he hinting something here? Is it just me, or is he sending a message? This line about Christ being the only rock. And I got bombarded by people who basically were very upset that I would insinuate anything other than Cardinal Sarah is completely loyal and 100% supportive of Pope Francis. And just by an odd coincidence, he's also the favorite of people who really can't stand Pope Francis to be the next Pope. But anyway, I'm sorry. Now I'm getting a little bit too casual. So anyway,
I think the situation.
So anyway, so then the feast of the chair of St. Peter landed on Monday.
Yes.
And there was another bishop who I won't name his name. Someone else might want to, who made another post about how on the feast of the chair of St. Peter that Christ is the only rock. And it just occurred to me that Peter is it's a very popular anti-Catholic Protestant apologetic talking point to say Christ is my only rock, not Peter. Right. And then they've got their the translation's different. It's just a little pebble. It's not, Peter's just a pebble. Christ is the rock. And it's just odd for me to hear it in a Catholic context. So I decided that I would just, based on statements from past popes and the catechism and councils, that for Catholics, Peter is the rock. So that's, the authority was given to him by Christ. Matthew 16:18, you are Peter, and upon this, Peter literally means rock, and upon this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it. And we have this long history of teaching on papal primacy, papal authority, and it's all documented. Like, people say I'm just like worship Pope, and I'm like, no, I really wanted to find out. And this is what happened in 2010 to 2013. I studied, I thought that all these traditions had this objective standard. I didn't know if it was a book or something where we could tell if we compared this book to what the Pope was saying, that we could figure out whether or not the Pope was actually teaching real Catholic teaching. I thought that they were just smarter than me, or they knew something I didn't. And then I started reading the documents of Vatican I, the documents of the CDF, the documents of every Pope named Pius in the last 150 years, and John Paul II. And it's wait a minute, no. The guarantor of fidelity to scripture and tradition is the Pope. That's what the Catholic Church teaches. That's what every Pope has taught since Vatican I, very strongly. Pope Francis taught it in his speech at the close of the First Synod on the Family, that the Synod walks together with and under Peter. So that's basically so I just wanted to articulate that again on the day of the feast. Now, I kind of have this tendency when the feast day comes around, that's when I start thinking about the feast day. So I basically wrote it that afternoon and posted it at 11 o'clock that night. So like all the people in England and Australia are on the next day. But anyway, that's where that came from. And I've talked way too much during this hour. So I'm going to mute myself and I want to hear from David and Melinda.
Well, I think that one thing valuable that you're posted, it wasn't just like an ode to Peter and to the successor of Peter, but also a discussion of the very real ways that bishops and cardinals need to behave in relation to Peter. And so I would be interested in talking more about what is undermining the ability of many bishops to publicly do that. Like, why are they choosing not to kind of act as vocally in union with the successor of Peter as you might expect them to, given Catholic teaching? Or like, do they have other interests? Like, is it because of some of these conspiracy kind of far right trends in the church that we've been talking about? I don't know if David, you wanted to jump in here.
David probably can talk.
I can definitely jump in there, and maybe I can pull some threads together by by saying, I'm willing to say that I think what we're looking at is we've seen the development over time, and it's maybe over a long time, but it's only become more apparent since the Francis papacy of what I would refer to as a church within the church. So there's basically there's the institutional church, and then there's another church that's sort of underneath, and it's largely lay led. It's ultra conservative. It's often traditionalist. It has a very dualistic worldview. So it's just the church versus the world. It is extremely susceptible to conspiracy theory, New World Order conspiracy theory, especially. And the language often veers into the far right or extreme right. And one thing about this sort of church within the church is I think and this is what makes it very difficult, is that to deal with, is that it's extremely well organized and well funded, often from donations. I think a lot of it is really true believers here. And it has a much better grasp on communication than the institutional church, especially when it comes to social media. And it will do its own thing. And if the Pope, offers something that they can agree with, they'll use that. If the Pope doesn't, they will push back against the Pope. And it consists of, I'm thinking in particular where I'm in Canada, we know LifeSite News very well. And it's one of these organizations that I think sort of belongs to this church within the church. And I mean, other groups would be like, Church Militant in the US, or, the global network of like tradition, family, property type groups. And now I don't want to say that EWTN is far right. It's not far right, but even EWTN functions as a sort of church within the church in the United States, and in some other parts of the world. And there's very few bishops that they actually look up to. You get the same people showing up over and over again. It's Cardinal Burke, it's Bishop Athanasius Schneider, it's Archbishop Vigano, and sometimes Cardinal Sarah. Like that's he's one of the heroes of that sort of again, the sort of church within the church. So I think that a lot of bishops may fear this sort of this very powerful network, and may in some cases play to it, because they know, you can either be a sort of ordinary hardworking bishop in the larger institutional church and not get a lot of publicity, not have a lot of people listen to you necessarily, or you can appeal to this sort of church within the church, and all of a sudden you're a hero. You're everywhere. You're at all these conferences. You're like shared on websites all over the place, and you can build a sort of power base by doing that. And now I actually think too that this it's not strictly traditionalist, although it tends to tend toward traditionalism for sure. I would say it even goes back to before Vatican II. I mean, you have in the 1920s and 30s, you have people like Father Charles Coughlin in the United States, the radio priest who became hugely popular, and preached a sort of populist, conspiracy theory driven far right sort of version of Catholicism that eventually led him to just full on sympathizing with the Nazi party. You have Father Dennis Fahey, who was an Irish priest who wrote anti-Semitic conspiracy theory books that have also become sort of classics of the far right. I think this sort of mentality has often existed. The Feeneyites existed before Vatican II as well. It's hard to know exactly what it is, but it feels almost like a sort of Gnosticism, like it's a kind of dualistic worldview. And I think, Mike, you're right, pointing to the French Revolution as the beginning of this. You had a sort of extreme reaction in France on the part of Catholics to the French Revolution, understandable in some respects, but then it hardened into this, sort of extreme right version of Catholicism. You get a lot of the conspiracy theory, anti-Semitism coming out of that sort of milieu. And then that carries on, and we're just like, you look at someone like Taylor Marshall, his book Infiltration. It's just a catalog of this stuff that he's found on the internet from all these sort of traditionalist and conspiracy theory sites that he's just sort of pasted together really into a narrative that now features Pope Francis. But I think, this stuff has been there all along. It's just now we're in a very difficult time because the people who are part of this sort of church within the church are in many ways more powerful in terms of their communications, in terms of the even sometimes the amount of money that's flowing through this than the institutional church. And the institutional church always seems to be sort of trailing behind, trying to respond to this. But the people like Taylor Marshall, they can pop out a YouTube video every single day if they want to about the latest controversy, and people will be glued to it. So it's a very difficult thing, but yeah, I think it's something we're going to have to face up to eventually.
I think it's almost like we could sit here and try to untangle the threads and undercurrents that led us to where we are right now for another hour or two, and still not get to the bottom of it. But really, since the pandemic, it seems to have really accelerated in terms of what a lot of people are experiencing on the ground and in their own parishes, or maybe we're not present to our parishes as we used to be. We're kind of virtually interacting with fellow parishioners, and the Catholic community has really been fragmented even more than it even was pre-pandemic. And I think that's what came out too in that 60-minute segment I mentioned earlier, was the radicalization that's happened during the pandemic. Like they identified these undercurrents and then really said the isolation caused by the COVID pandemic has really just launched everything in a whole new direction and allowed people to really go full throttle into conspiracy theories and see their family members really get sucked into that. And I think kind of going back to our personal experiences, or what Melinda was talking about, and just in our daily lives, how we are coping with maybe a church where many of our fellow Catholics were not quite recognizing how they identify faithful Catholicism as being the Catholicism that we seek to practice. How can we really move forward? How can we find common ground with our fellow Catholics in the church? Where can we kind of move maybe towards our friends and family members to draw them out of this kind of conspiracist mindset? I'm not sure if there's any direction that anyone has an insight there to share. I know that for myself, it's like prayer and companionship seem to be the only thing. I know that it's highly unlikely that our little live stream is going to ever convince Taylor Marshall to lock it up and go home. We'll see if that happens. But there's so much that doesn't seem to be an intellectual commitment. It seems to be a very personal, a lack of community and a division and fragmentation that's happened because of the pandemic. That how can we reach out and really get people back with us? So, Melinda.
Yeah, well, I do think one of the largest missing pieces to the puzzle is from the top down, right? I had very strong bonds, extremely strong bonds with some of the people I've tried to reach out to and who very much once respected my insights, spiritually and otherwise. And I can say that a lot of those that are already knee deep, it's not, I don't see where like the conversation could have been different and ended in a different result in multiple times, right? And so I do think we have to really be real about that. I hear a lot of people say, well, it's just about dialogue. Well, again, maybe I'm speaking anecdotally, but dialogue, the problem is so big that dialogue itself is not going to cut it. And I want to bring up before when you were asking about why are the bishops not all on board? And I think a lot of it is more to do with ignorance, like, and the literal definition of the word. They don't know what's going on. When my parish has been very much taken over by QAnon conspiracist traditionalists, right? I set up a meeting with my pastor, who I think means well. He is not. He's not even what I would consider a traditionalist priest. And he had never heard of Taylor Marshall, right? And I'm trying to lay out these problems, and I never even heard back from him to continue. And my point to go to him was to say, look, this is your parish. These are the spiritual traps in which they're falling into. And I got nothing back. And this is not to talk like smack on him or anything, but it's to say that the leadership itself does not seem to recognize the magnitude of the problem. So when I hear that 20% of Catholics are in QAnon, I'm like, well, duh. Because I've seen it on the ground, and not just anecdotally in my parish, but I'm from across the country. I live in California now. I'm from Georgia. My husband's family is from Wisconsin. His family is all in QAnon. My family, not as much, but the circles in which I had developed spiritual friendships with in my parish is in the QAnon. It's in the homeschool co-ops across the country. It's so widespread and prolific that parishes are being taken over while pastors and bishops don't even see the problem. So I don't know if that was very helpful to say where we go, but I think there are some people who are not knee deep in it and who are starting to wake up. There are some. And so there's some hope there. But as for those knee deep, I really feel like leadership is going to have to take over. And sometimes I hope that our site, and similar outlets can bring awareness so that leadership can start addressing this too, because it's got to come from multiple angles. And I hope too, again, I think the problem is largely fomented online. And so I hope to see more online content that combats that will help. But it's definitely not, it's a situation that has been decades in building the foundation for and the vulnerabilities for. And yes, the past year, the election, the pandemic, Black Lives Matter, all of that, all of the social changes and things we're going through have kind of taken those vulnerabilities and exacerbated them to this massive problem that we have now. But the problems have been decades in the making. And so I really hope to see, from a very personal standpoint, as someone who's trying as hard as I possibly can to fight this from just a lay parishioner standpoint, I really do think that we need leadership to step into this and to see the scale. So that's my 2 cents.
Yeah, I think that's definitely true. And I appreciated what you said about how sometimes the leadership are acting out of ignorance, at least partially. When I hear a bishop talking about how there's microchips in COVID vaccines or things that are really extreme conspiracy theory, like very fringe, I think of some misuse of information online. So there is definitely that intellectual component of it and the ignorance that can be answered. And then there's all of that pre-intellectual, sense of belonging that is provided by being in a community of similar believers. And I think maybe just to sort of wrap this up, we're at an hour here now, but the foundation of our community as Catholics and shared believers is in union with the Pope. So I think that reflecting on the teaching of Pope Francis and his leadership can also be a key towards unlocking in each of our own lives the ability to discern and to know how to act towards those people in our lives who might be trapped in conspiracy theories still. But also for those who might be confused, just to accept some guidance from a very trustworthy teacher. Mike, did you have anything to wrap up with? I saw you on.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the key that Pope Francis sees these competing visions going around, and I keep going back to reality is greater than ideas, and it's not just that; it's also that he is very immediate in how he addresses the reality. He addresses the person that's right in front of him. He addresses the poor that are in our world that are truly in need, the people who've suffered from disasters. And I think sometimes when we take our mind off the reality of the person who is in front of us or the person in need, and I mean real people, not the idea of people in need, but that there are people in need, that there are people who are hurting, that there are people who need God. And instead, we inhabit this world of ideas and this world of fantasies and this world of conspiracies. That's where the destruction begins. I think our imaginations can get away from us. And I think that Pope Francis can be a very realistic guide. I think Fratelli Tutti is a good guide for that. But honestly, I brought it up earlier. I would recommend The Joy of the Gospel. For anyone who really read it with an open mind. This is Pope Francis's blueprint for the church. It's a long exhortation, but it really breaks down family life, the role of the pastor, the role of the parish, the role of the homily. What does it mean to preach? What does it mean to approach someone who's of a different faith? I think his approach is very real. It's very tangible, and it's very applicable in a world that has started to fall away from the idea of just taking faith for granted or taking the church for granted. So fortunately, we have a pope who trusts in science, who trusts in history, who is grounded in the wisdom that has built up over the years in our society, but he applies it he approaches each of these things in a Catholic way. And rather than making up fantasies or challenging narratives when we have absolutely no expertise whatsoever, to look at them with a critical eye, but a critical eye of how would a Catholic approach these findings, as opposed to how would a Catholic or as a Catholic, I'm going to reject it altogether. So I guess that's my advice is maybe give Pope Francis another shot, because if nothing else, he is real.
Yeah, that reminds me, he's going to Iraq next week. We have been talking about some issue that affects, the United States, maybe Western Europe. And it's kind of like an esoteric, intellectual, very online thing, it can seem sometimes. But there's a very real trip happening next week, very high risk, kind of adventurous pandemic tour of the Pope and his entourage. They're going to arrive in Iraq March 5th, and there's lots of travels planned throughout the country, and visiting with very persecuted population of Christians remaining in Iraq. So as we're signing off here, we can all keep Pope Francis and his safety and the, I guess, productivity and gospel centeredness of that trip in our prayers for the next week. And we will see how that's begun, hopefully, when we meet again. And
if you like this show, you can support us on Patreon.
Yeah. Yes,
go to wherepeopleiz.com, the right-hand column, and goodbye.
Subscribe to our YouTube channel. You can follow us. This episode will be available as a podcast, hopefully this weekend, in case you want to listen again. But we will be back soon with another conversation. So
take care.
Bye.